Welcome to Biology Minds. Today we're going to talk about physical evidence. So the third chapter after crime scene, we talk about physical evidence. The two types of evidence that we talk about are direct evidence, and typically this is going to be verbal confessions. So, a confession from the guilty individual or suspect. All right, that's going to basically be your direct evidence that's going to tell you what happened, and you're going to be able to not only build your case, but prosecute that person to the full extent at that point. And then any eyewitnesses that you have are going to help you build a strong case because they were there and they provide direct evidence as to what happened, who was there, how it happened, who, what, when, where, why. And then we have circumstantial evidence, which this whole chapter 3 in the textbook is about. It's about the physical evidence as well as some of the testimonies that you might get from people that aren't direct eyewitnesses but can add to the case and kind of build a case about what type of person these people involved in the case are or were, and help add corroborate evidence as to what happened and help to build your crime scene. So the whole time, by using evidence, we want to rebuild our crime scene. And what that means is that we want to figure out what exactly happened, who was involved, how did it go down, and everything that is included. So we use physical evidence because a lot of times we won't get a confession from the suspect, and possibly we won't have any eyewitnesses. So we're going to use physical evidence to try to make sense of what happened, when did it happen, how did it happen. And you can use this physical evidence in order to kind of make sense of our crime scene, in order to reconstruct our crime scene or rebuild our crime scene. And it's all used for comparison. So that's why we call it circumstantial. If you find a random knife, well, that might mean nothing to the case. It might mean everything to the case. It really depends on the circumstances. If the person wasn't stabbed, then finding a knife probably doesn't mean anything. So it's all about circumstances. And some of the eyewitness drawbacks to think about are that people, if you ever see in My Cousin Vinny, people forget things. Maybe their eyesight isn't what they used to be. So you can't exactly take into account everything that the eyewitness says, but depending on the circumstance, if you have more than eyewitness and they're all kind of saying the same thing, that's very helpful. But just to keep in mind that we don't always remember the things the way that we think we necessarily do. Things can kind of change in our head, and they've done studies and they've shown that eyewitnesses are often kind of add to stories, and it's not even on purpose. It's just the way that our mind works. We try to make sense and try to fill in the pieces that we of the puzzle that we don't necessarily have, and that's something to keep in mind. So forgetfulness, poor eyesight, or poor hearing. Fear can also play a role if they have been threatened to be hurt. If they are going to testify, then maybe they change their story and the story is not as good as you hoped it would be. Personal bias, if they like the person, they dislike the person, they can kind of embellish. And then any impediments, maybe they were tired when they witnessed this, or that they're not the smartest tool in the shed, or any lack of knowledge about what exactly was going on. Maybe they saw it one way, but really that's not exactly what's going on. And then any inconsistent testimony where that is possibly impeachable. So the defense is going to want to possibly impeach any eyewitness that they don't think is legitimate. So evidence collectors and detectives, they are trained, like I've said many times. You see that smaller precincts don't really have the resources to have specific evidence collectors, so they're going to depend on their detectives and their police officers, and they're going to train them yearly in order for them to learn the proper way of collecting evidence. So it's not always an evidence collector that's going to collect the evidence, but whoever it is, they need to be trained, and they should constantly be trained every year or every so often in order to keep up with their knowledge base about collecting evidence. It shouldn't be something where you do it once in the beginning of your career and then you never do it again. But ultimately, when it comes to detectives, the hard part is that you need to know what is important, what isn't important, and what may be important. So that's something that isn't necessarily learned, and it really takes some intuition to understand what to keep your eye on, and what's going to be important in taking back to the crime lab in order to really help build your case. So remember Locard's principle, particles, they're always going to be exchanged at any crime scene. You're going to leave something there, you're going to take something with you, and that's really what this whole idea of physical evidence is all about. We need to collect the physical evidence, we need to pinpoint these particles. So maybe there's particles out there that we're not able to get, we're not able to locate, we're not able to process. They're not necessarily helpful, but there are always particles out there that have been left and have been taken with people, and that is what Locard's principle is all about. So common types of physical evidence: blood, semen, saliva, documents, drugs, explosives, firearms, any ammunition, fibers. Typically, when we talk about fibers, we're talking about hair, but it could be also synthetic fibers, pieces of clothing, whether it's cotton, polyester, or any other type of fiber like that. Fingerprints, glass, any impressions such as shoe prints or tire marks, bite marks. These are all impression evidence. And then organs and physiological fluids, gastric fluids for the presence of drugs or poisons and alcohol. Paint, petroleum products, meaning grease, oil, gas, plastic bags. Think about, bodies are often wrapped in garbage bags, so maybe there is more evidence on there. Maybe you can use that plastic bag to help reconstruct your crime scene. And then, any plastic or polymers or rubbers from tires, containers, or whatever it may be. All of these things can be physical evidence that are used to help build your case. So it could mean nothing. It could mean everything, and really, there's no set of guidelines or rules that's going to tell you what to collect, what not to collect, and it really is up to the detective to have the intuition, to have the know-it-all, to say we're going to take this, we're going to take this, we're going to leave that. That's not important. This is important, and to send what they need to the crime lab in order to build their case and reconstruct their crime scene. Powder residues, serial numbers. Think about cars have serial numbers, firearms have serial numbers. These are specific to that specific car, to that specific firearm. Even if you have something that's mass produced, they might have a serial number that they only made 100 of those. When we talk about the O.J. Simpson trial, he had a very nice set of gloves, and there were only so many of them made, and they were able to say, hey, he was one of the 100 people that actually bought these gloves. So even if you think, well, the serial number isn't for just one set of gloves, it can be used. So you want to collect this. It's better to be safe than sorry. Also, soil, minerals, these also can be used by forensic geologists. Tool marks, vehicle lights, it could be something where if someone testifies what the lights look like, you want to have that on record. So was the light on or off at the time of impact? Was it day or was it night? It may help to reconstruct the crime scene or to corroborate information in order to say, hey, this person said that this happened during the day, but their lights were on, so it must have been at night. All those details are very important. And then any wood or vegetative matter can also be used. Physical evidence is usually collected for identification and or usually for comparison. So we need that in order to identify what is this physical evidence, who did it belong to, and compare it to other physical evidence. Identification of evidence is important because it can later be used to compare to other samples. Comparison is a major part of crime scene investigations and convicting a suspect. So if we collect soil from a crime scene and we're able to find that soil in the grooves of that person's boots, well, then that helps us to build our case. Individual characteristics, that's evidence that can be associated with a common source with an extremely high degree of probability. All right, individual characteristic, it's coming from one place, one person, one origin. Okay, think about fingerprints, bullet marks. All right, fingerprints, you're the only person in the world, or in the history of the world, even in the history of Homo sapiens, to have those specific fingerprints. That is individual characteristics. Okay, bullet marks, those striations made on that bullet, that is individual to that specific gun. Knife markings, it's going to be specific to that knife. Or broken objects like tail lights. All right, if I were to break a tail light, it's only going to break that way once. I could take 1,000 Honda Civic tail lights and break all of them, and then none of them would break the same exact way. So keep in mind that, you know, by being able to take these pieces and fit them back together like a puzzle, jigsaw fit, we like to call it, that is going to give us individual evidence. The other type of evidence that we talk about is class evidence. It's not individual evidence. It's not going to pinpoint one specific person or origin, but it can help us to weed out what group does it not belong to. Okay, so class evidence is also important. And if you have enough class evidence, you have this class evidence and this class evidence and this class evidence, well, then you can put them together, and ultimately it creates individual evidence by having all this class evidence. Okay, yeah, you having a blue hoodie is not very rare. Okay, but you having a blue hoodie with a size 10 shoe with a Armani belt and with an American Eagle pants and have this type of knife and have this type of earrings, all these things put together, now you're starting to whittle down. All right, you know, if you have a number of suspects, you can start weeding out those suspects and say, well, it can't be this guy because he doesn't wear size 10. It can't be this guy because he's never owned an Armani belt, and it can't be this guy, so on and so forth. So as much as we want individual evidence, class evidence is also helpful as well. So advantages of class evidence: it provides corroboration of events based on objective scientific data, so we can still use it in order to reconstruct our crime scene. Often the chances or odds of encountering two indistinguishable items of class physical evidence which actually originated from different sources are slight, so chances are if we find an Armani belt, it's going to be the same as some other Armani belt, but we still want our class characteristics or our class evidence. When dealing with more than one type of class evidence, their collective presence, or the fact that now it's even less likely to have this class evidence, this class evidence, and this class evidence than just having one of those class evidences. So it can lead to an extremely high certainty that they originated from the same source. Physical evidence, whether it be an individual or class, shows great weight in the courtroom. You are using this physical evidence to build your case. Okay, that's what the defense is trying to fight against, because you are saying, hey, it can't be anyone else but this one person, this one suspect. And class evidence may also serve to exonerate a person from a crime. So class evidence is great for saying, hey, that guy, he never had an Armani belt, and this guy and we know for a fact, for whatever reason, let's just say for an example, we know for a fact that the person that committed this crime had an Armani belt. So now we can say, all right, all the suspects that we think it could possibly be that never had an Armani belt, we can weed them out, and now we're left with even less people that can possibly be our suspects. So we talk about the product rule. Okay, yeah, having that Armani belt, you're not the only one that's going to have that. But then if you put the Armani belt with the special type of shoes and with the special type of pants and the shirt, and they were driving this car, all right, now we add these all together, and ultimately, if we have data on the frequency of people having this, if you say, all right, yeah, it's a 1 in a million chance of having those shoes, and it's a 1 in 1,000 chance of having that belt, and it's a 1 in 5,000 chance of having those pants. Well, now when you multiply those all together, now it becomes a lot more rare for someone to have all those things. Yeah, it's only a 1 in a million chance to have the one thing, but then when you multiply them all together, now it's very rare that someone were to have all these things. So DNA is very important in cases as well, because it's high probability that you're the only sample that has that in the world. In theory, they always talk about, in theory, you could have the same DNA as someone else. All right, twins have the same DNA, but it's just not going to happen. It's astronomical. Right? And when they look at your DNA, they look at long enough segments to say that, hey, there's no way that you are ever going to have the same DNA as someone else. Okay, in theory, yeah, it could somehow, in a trillion years, it could somehow happen that you have the same A's and T's and C's and G's line up the same way, but it's just not going to happen that way because it's almost impossible for that to happen because there's so many of those nucleotides, so many of those A's, those T's, those C's, and those G's. So we can use that in court and say, hey, we found this DNA. It's this person's DNA. There's no way that it's ever going to be anyone else but this person. And that's why we like DNA so much. So an example of the product rule is the O.J. Simpson trial. During the O.J. Simpson trial, DNA wasn't what it is today. Right now, we know a lot more about it and we use it a lot more in court cases. But back then, they weren't too sure about what are the chances of someone else having that DNA. And that's what the defense, that's what Johnny Cochran and all of them, that's what they were able to argue to say, hey, you can't tell us beyond a reasonable doubt that it isn't someone else's DNA. They didn't know enough back then. All right, they were kind of ignorant when it came to DNA, and that's why DNA wasn't used the way it was back then because it was a new thing. Now, fast forward 25 years, and you see that DNA is a staple. We love DNA, we use DNA, but back then the defense was able to argue, hey, we can't use DNA. But what they did like to look at, they were looking at blood. All right, so in your blood we have various factors or various proteins, and they looked at these different proteins. He was type A. He had this protein ESD1 and this protein PGM2 positive, 2 negative. And scientists actually knew the frequency of people having this. So they said, all right, the chance of you having type A blood, and this is a real thing, type A blood, 26% chance of you having type A blood. The chance of you having this ESD1 protein in your blood, 85% chance. So that's kind of high chance of having that, okay? But we're adding that in. We're multiplying these frequencies together to make a smaller and smaller number. Then we looked at this protein right here, this PGM protein, and only 2% of the population have that. So by multiplying them all together, if you know anything about statistics, you multiply those all together, you're going to end up with a 0.44% chance of having that. So now we went from saying, all right, 85 out of 100 people have this one and 26 out of 100 people have this one. Now we got down to, hey, 1 in 227 people have all three of these. Okay, so by adding these all together, yeah, 26% of people have this one, 85% of people have this one, and 2% of people have this one. But the chances of having all three is very small, and that's what they were able to argue. Now, some weaknesses in forensic science: the inability to assign exact or even approximate probability of occurrence for class evidence. So a lot of things we don't have the numbers for. All right, how many size 10 Air Force One Nikes are out there? We don't really know. Okay, how many people have thrown out their Armani belts into the garbage? We don't have that. Okay, but they can use these to help build their case. So it's become harder as more things are mass produced. Once upon a time, things were made by small businesses, and you can track them back to that small business, and that small business could say, yeah, actually I made something like this for a guy named this, and you can help build your case from that. Now, you say, oh, I have a size 10 Air Force Ones. Well, that doesn't really help you, but we still are going to use that to help build our case. We do not process the data to calculate probability. Possess the data of specific occurrences of each piece of class evidence. Blood factors are an exception, where we talked about how we knew that 26% of people had type A blood. Practitioners tend to try to only collect physical evidence with significant amount of diversity, but often this cannot be immediately determined. So, better safe than sorry. You're going to want to take anything that you think is significant. Forensic scientists will try to use multiple pieces and types of class evidence to show as a collective to prove that they must have came from the same source. All right, an example is Wayne Williams. He murdered a bunch of people in Atlanta, Georgia, and they used actually 28 different fibers to prove that he was guilty of numerous murders. So, if you only have one fiber and you say, oh, it's from polyester, a blue polyester sweater, well, that doesn't really do much. But they had 28 fibers, and they were able to prove, hey, there's no way that anyone else could leave these 28 exact same fibers as Wayne Williams did. As technology becomes more sophisticated, practitioners have become more specialized to analyze evidence and be expert witnesses. Excuse me, the jury plays a major role in deciding if the evidence is substantial. So that's really, the DA's job to make sure that they argue, hey, this is significant, and the defense attorneys are going to fight this the whole time. But if something is substantial, you have to, get that from the lab and argue that. But we see sometimes that justice is blind, and juries and judges can kind of ruin a case that to anybody else it might seem obvious. So crime scene reconstruction, it takes experienced law enforcement, medical examiners, and criminalists, crime scene investigators, helps create a scenario and a sequence of events or a timeline. That's where we talk about reconstructing our crime scene. Medical examiner can establish if the body has been moved. Criminalists can determine if evidence has been altered and help analyze evidence at the scene, such as blood splatter analysis, preserving impressions. We're going to use photographs, we're going to lift any impressions, and we're going to make a cast of those impressions. So when we talk about tire impressions or shoe prints, you want to make sure you take photographs before you try to lift any impressions. Then you're going to lift the impressions, then you're going to make a cast of those impressions. So individual evidence is always more significant than class evidence, even though we want our class evidence, and we're going to use as much class evidence as possible and put them together in order to kind of create individual evidence. So we have DNA is our number one, fingerprints are our number two, and then these are kind of tied, but we talk about jigsaw fit and hair fibers are also very important. But DNA is everything to us, and fingerprints is a close number two. Blood typing is based on the surface antigens, these proteins that are in the blood, on our red blood cells, as well as the antibodies present in the blood. Different blood types are varying antigens and antibodies which can be tested using blood typing serums. So if you have donated blood before, that's what they do. They are using these blood typing serums, and they're finding out what your surface antigens on your blood are, and that's how they decide it, or they distinguish between if you're A positive, B negative, O positive, whatever it may be. So here is an example. If you have type A blood, you have surface antigen A, and then you have anti-B antibodies. Type B, you have surface antigen B, and you have anti-A antibodies. Type AB, you have surface antigens A and B, and you have neither anti-A or anti-B antibodies. And then type O, you have neither A nor B surface antigens, and you have anti-A and anti-B antibodies. So this is our universal donor, all right, because there's not going to be any issue with the surface antigens causing a reaction. And this is going to be our universal recipient. So positive and negative blood types are based on the Rh factor, which is another antigen. Positive indicates that you have the Rh factor. Negative means that you don't have the Rh factor on your red blood cells. So you're either positive or negative, and then you're either A, B, O, or AB. This is how it looks when you are testing them. So we put in these certain types of serums in there, and depending on what happens, that's how we distinguish. Okay, we see that if it's going to clot with the presence of anti-A serum, it's going to be A, and if we use our Rh factor serum or our anti-D serum and it clots, then it's going to be positive. So this one, it clots with B and also with anti-D. So anti-B and anti-D, that's B positive. Here it doesn't do anything, you have O negative. Impression evidence. Okay, we're talking about tire impressions, shoe prints, even a knife impression or a tool impression. All right, can be defined as objects or materials that have retained the characteristics of other objects through direct contact. So impressions are created when one object is pressed against another material with enough force to leave an impression of the object. So shoe prints, tool marks, tire tracks, bite marks even, and then anything from a fired bullet or a knife, any type of tool mark. Those are examples of impression evidence. Impressions may be found in or on many different types of materials. The quality of the impression depends on the object making the impressions and the surface conditions, such as how hard or soft it is and what type of material it is. So soil, mud, dust, concrete, grass, skin, all these things can leave an impression, can have an impression left in them, even snow. All right, the thing with snow is obviously it's going to melt, so you want to immediately get your mold, take pictures, get your molds, try to lift those prints. Investigators analyze the impression evidence to find unique characteristics. So we want to find unique characteristics. If we look at some of our class characteristics, it's going to be shoe size, type of shoe, is it a boot or is it a sneaker, as well as the brand of the shoe. And then we're going to look at specific wear marks as our individual characteristics to link, the shoes to a specific person. You can do the same for tires, tool marks, or any other object that's going to leave an impression. So you have collection methods. You have 2D. This type of impression is used. You're using photography. Some impressions may be dusted with fingerprint powder if we're talking about fingerprints, or lifted with a special type of tape, and they may also be collected using an electrostatic dust lifting process. 3D we talk about can be documented using photography, but we are using casting. Okay, so we are making a mold of that impression. Tire tracks are important in forensic investigations and are usually found in road accident scenes or in the access and escape routes of other crime scenes. Investigators may make ink prints of a tire or plaster casts. Once again, we're talking about casts, making a mold of a track, or even take photographs. So some of the features you're going to look at: tread patterns, width and depth of the tread pattern, unique characteristics due to the wear pattern. So we can use that to find out what type of tire it was, what brand of tire it was, and then we also can look at more individual characteristics such as wear pattern and the width and the depth of the tread pattern. So tire databases are available, just like we have shoe databases, and it can help us to distinguish what type of vehicle it was, what maybe even what make and model of the vehicle. Tool marks, certain defects or patterns may be left on a tool when it is made or used, which can be used to then find matches. At the crime scene, we find the specific tool mark, and then we find the specific tool that made that mark. Not necessarily that it's a knife, but that it's this very specific knife that has these very specific markings or striations or broken pieces or teeth to them that is the same exact knife, and we can use that to help build our case and reconstruct our crime scene. So, we can either talk about two things, either tool marks as impressions, when as a tool hits a softer surface, the shape of the tool and the impression in the surface may be left behind as an impression, and also scratches as the tool moves across a surface, it may leave ridges or, like I said, striations, those markings, those lines behind. So some tool marks are a combination of both types. Typically, we talk about both the impression that are left and any scratches that we can find in it. And then features to analyze: dimensions of the impressions, ridges or striation patterns, defects such as nicks and chips, and then paint chips or metal shards left on a tool. Investigators can analyze a shoe print to determine its class or the type of brand of shoe. They will also look for individual characteristics such as wear patterns and specific damages or defects. Databases of shoe prints are available. We're going to talk about SACAR 6. Which is a database that they use in order to figure out what the brand, the make, the model of the shoe is. Depending on the quality of the impression, investigators may be able to determine a person's speed, walking or running, as well as establish the size of a person based on the impression's depth. Investigators may be able to determine a person's speed. We see that if they are elongated, if you ever run in the snow, you'll see that your footprints are very elongated from you running, and that is going to tell you that you are running, opposed to if they're shorter or they're just the size of your actual shoe, then you're going to see that the person was walking. Bite marks. Investigators can analyze bite marks for characteristics to help them identify victims or suspects. Marks can be left on the victim's skin or other objects, such as styrofoam cups, gum, or food. Anything that someone takes a bite into, and then you can look at dental records, including X-rays. Remember, when you go to the dentist, they take X-rays, and that can help you to figure out, who the specific person was that took that bite. Some features to look at: type of bite mark. All right, it was a human, was it animal? Characteristics of the teeth. All right, position of the teeth. Any dental work that was done. Which teeth are bigger than others? Which ones made the impressions? Color of area to estimate how long ago the bite occurred, so old or recent bite. And then swab for body fluids because you're hoping that you have some DNA in any saliva. If you look at this tooth, all right, that is going to be a red flag. All right, not that many people are going to have that, and that's going to help you to, if you see a bite mark, it's going to help you to say, hey, it must have come from this mouth, this person right here. Also, some final notes: blood spatter evidence. Blood spatter can indicate the distance of the source, direction of travel, nature of force used, sequencing of bloodshed events, transfer patterns, and even object used to cause the injury. So we like to look at the blood that is left at a scene and how was it left, not just looking at the blood to get the DNA from it and get the blood type and everything else from it, but what happened, how was that blood left there. So we see low velocity impact spatter where blood falls at the speed or force of normal gravity. It just, you're standing right there and it drops from it, right from you in 90-degree angle, and it's going to look like this. It's going to have this circular look like this. If it's a medium velocity, blood falls at a speed or force greater than that of normal gravity from an angle less than 90 degrees. So we see that it's kind of making these elongated marks, all right, typically seen in stabbings or when victims are running from the scene. Okay, so if you're just standing there, you're going to have a low velocity impact spatter. If you're running or you get stabbed, you're going to see these medium velocity impact spatter. And then finally, you're going to have high velocity impact spatter. Usually we're going to see this with gunshots and explosions, and it's just little tiny dots all over the place. So those are some things to look at or think about when we talk about blood spatter evidence. As we move on, just keep in mind that we have to continue to think about the crime scene, reconstructing our crime scene, and how are we going to use the different types of physical evidence in order to build our case.